Hello, this is the second video for the week that I'm going to be away in Texas. In this video, we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways. So Thomas Aquinas lived a little bit later than St. Anselm, about 100 years later. He was born in the year 1225, maybe not 100 years later then. But he was born in the year 1225 and lived in that 13th century. He died in 1274, which means that he was younger than me when he died. He died at about age 48 or 49, sometime in that. Like St. Anselm, he was born in Italy, and like St. Anselm, he made his way to France. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. Now he was an early Dominican. They didn't have Dominicans around when St. Anselm was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right, so St. Anselm was a Benedictine monk. St. Thomas was a Dominican. So in the 11th century, when Anselm lived, there was just the Benedictine order in the West, pretty much. But in the 13th century, we had the arising of the mendicant orders in Western Europe. There were 2 mendicant orders. So whereas monastics, were tied to monasteries, the mendicants, the mendicant friars and the mendicant sisters traveled around. So they were these professed religious people who would travel. So in the 13th century, they came in 2 kinds. So first there were the Franciscan, or the orders of friars minor, the order of little brothers. These were started by St. Francis of Assisi, and they had a special devotion to poverty, and they had this mission to kind of restore and renovate Western Christendom. The Dominicans, which are known as the order of preachers, they were started by St. Dominic in Spain, and they were started to fight the heresy of Albigensianism. So we don't have to go into what Albigensianism is. That's not really important for our purposes. But what is important is that this was a traveling order of preachers. And since it was a traveling order of preachers, they placed a high premium on education. These were highly educated churchmen, and being highly educated churchmen, placing a premium on education, that meant that they built and staffed universities. And so there are still some Dominican universities in the world today. The Angelicum is the Dominican University in Rome, but the University of Paris at this time, first was an early university, and second was a Dominican institution. And that is where St. Thomas Aquinas ended up, and that's probably where he wrote the Summa Theologiae, which is the book that we're going to be reading from. Now, the Summa Theologiae, which means the summary of theology, is a multi-volume, massive text, and we're going to be reading like 2 pages of it, so not very much. The text of the Summa was comprised of parts and questions and articles, right? Parts and questions and articles. The section that we're going to be reading from was really early in the text, right? So it was part 1, question 2. So part 1 dealt with the divine things. Question 2 is the existence of God, and this is article 3, does God exist? That's the question that we're reading from. And so he's got this article 3, does whether God exists. And St. Thomas wrote in a particular way when he wrote. So I'm going to kind of read to you the parts of this article that are missing so that you'll have an idea. So this is article 3, whether God exists, and that's the question that he's going to be answering. before he answers that question, he lists some objections, right? So when he lists the objections, these are the wrong answers. He's going to give you the wrong answer first, right? Then he's going to give you his answer, and then he's going to reply specifically to those wrong answers. And what we have in our textbook is just his answer. So I'm going to kind of complete the pieces for you here, right? So the question is whether or not God exists. And objection 1, so this is the wrong answer, the first wrong answer. He says, it seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable, but there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. So this is the first wrong answer. Then he's going to give a second wrong answer. Objection 2. Further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. Right? And so this principle that he's articulating here is later on it's going to come to be called Occam's razor, which is that the simplest solution to a problem is the one that's correct. So it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by few principles has been produced by many, but it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. And I think this objection is probably the one that most non-believers have in the world today, that there's not a reason to believe that God exists, that his existence makes things more complicated instead of simpler. So these are not new thoughts, right? These thoughts go back at least in the 13th century, and St. Thomas is going to deal with them. Then he has the section that's called the sed contrarius, on the contrary, and where he comes to the point, every article has an on the contrary, or in Latin sed contra, because of course these were all written in Latin in the 13th century. He is going to give the correct answer to the question, and because he's a scholastic, he's always going to quote an authority. And here, he's going to quote the authority of Scripture. So he says, on the contrary, it is said that it is said in the person of God, I am who am. And this is from the book of Exodus in the Bible, Exodus 3:14. This was the burning bush that was speaking to Moses that said, I am who am. And so we know now that this is the right answer, that God exists. And then he's going to go to the section that's called I answer that. And every article in the Summa has the I answer that question. And he's going to give us his answer. And that's the part that's in our textbook, right? And we will get to that. But before we get to that, after he has the answer that question section, he has the replies to the objections. And I kind of want to look at those first, and then we'll go back, because then we'll be in the section that's in our text, right? So the reply to objection 1, he's going to quote an authority. He says, as Augustine says, so this is Saint Augustine of Hippo, and he says it in the Enchiridion number 11. He says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such that to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the goodness, infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. So he had his objection. Remember, the objection was that if infinite goodness existed, there would be no evil found in the world. And his reply to this objection is, therefore, infinite goodness doesn't exist. His reply to his objection is to go back and look at St. Augustine, who says, no, God allows evil to exist so that he can bring good out of that. So the existence of evil allows more good in the world than just goodness by itself, right? So that's his answer to the first objection. The answer to objection 2 is probably more relevant to us, right? Because this is a more modern objection to the existence of God. He says, since nature works for a determinate end under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must be traced back to God as to its first cause. So also, whatever is done voluntarily must be traced back to some higher cause other than human reason or will, since these can change or fail. For all things that are changeable and capable of defect must be traced back to an immovable and self-necessary first principle, as was shown in the body of the article. Right? So what is he going to do? He's going to show us back to one of his 5 ways. Is going to be a direct answer to this question. And in fact, nearly all of his 5 ways are going to directly answer, because they're going to be showing how nature is not self-sufficient to explain itself. So that's a little bit of background and placing our reading that we're going to do in context. Right? And so the section of the article that we're going to read on the existence of God is the I answer that. It's the I answer that section. Right? And so it says, I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. And he's going to go and he's going to give us 5 proofs for the existence of God. And in your textbook, these are the 5 paragraphs. These are very short, right? Just like St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God is very short. St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God isn't among these 5. St. Thomas doesn't really have a good argument against St. Anselm, but he didn't like it. He didn't think that it proved its case as well. And you'll see that St. Thomas's arguments are less about logical operations and more about what we find in the world. So let's take a look. So the first, and this is on page 349 of our text, the first and quite obvious way is taken from a consideration of motion. It is certain and agreed on the basis of what our senses tell us that some things in this world are in motion. I don't think we could dispute that. But whatever it is in motion is moved by something else. I don't think that we would dispute that either. For nothing undergoes motion except insofar as it is in a state of potentiality in respect of that towards which it is moved. A thing moves in the active sense, on the other hand, insofar as it is in actuality. For moving in this sense is simply bringing something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be brought into actuality except by something which is itself in actuality. For example, something which is in actuality, which is actually hot, which is actually hot like fire, makes wood, which is hot in potentiality, hot in actuality, thereby moving and altering it. So what is he saying? For everything that is in the world, everything that is actual, right? Before it was actual, it was potential. So there are actual things and there are potential things. And we get this, right? This is kind of how we live our lives. We go to sleep at night and we're potentially awake. And then in the morning comes, we go from potentially awake to actually awake. This is how change and motion happens. We move from the potential to the actual. So we get this from Aristotle. So remember last week when we talked about Aristotle, we talked about the earth, and in particular the center of the earth being pure potential where nothing was moving. And then the things upon the earth were more potential but had some actuality. And then as we went out in the layers of the spheres, we got more and more actuality and less potential, right? Aquinas was a big fan of Aristotle. His thought is very, very Aristotelian. So everything moves from a state of potentiality to actuality. That's how the universe works. Things are in play, right? And you can only be moved from the potential to the actual by another thing that is actual, right? Two potentialities sitting next to each other cannot act and affect one another. There has to be something actually happening. This is what he's getting at. So it is impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, something should be both mover and moved, or that it should move itself. Hence, whatever is in motion is moved by something else. And if this something else is itself moved, it must in turn be moved by something else, and so on, right? So everything that is in motion has been moved by something else, and that thing was moved by something else. So we have this kind of chain. We have this chain of the actual things bringing the potential things into actuality. He says, but the sequence cannot continue ad infinitum. It cannot go on forever. Except in this case, there would not be any first mover. Hence, nothing would move anything else. Just nothing move anything else, and subsequent moving things do not move unless moved by an original mover, just as a stick does not move unless moved by a hand. Right? So anything that's moving has to have been moved by something else. And you can't go on to infinity, because that would be absurd. Because if you went on to an infinity, you would never reach the point where there was a first mover. There has to be a first mover, right? And the first mover, and that's the thing which is moved by nothing else, right? The unmoved mover, we should recognize this term from Aristotle, and the unmoved mover, everyone understands this to be God. That's what Aquinas says here. Right? So this is the first way. Now, this is heavily dependent upon a very Aristotelian understanding of physics and metaphysics, but that's how it goes. That's the first way. The second way is taken from the notion of an efficient cause. Right? So we remember what that is. That's the second cause, efficient cause. Right? There are 4 causes in Aristotle. There's 4 causes in Aquinas also. In the world that we perceive around us, we find an order of efficient causes, but we never find, nor is it possible that there should be something that is the efficient cause of itself. Or if there were, it would have to be prior to itself, which is impossible. But it is not possible for the series of efficient causes to go on ad infinitum, forever. For in each ordered series of efficient causes, the first item is the cause of the next item, and this in turn is the cause of the final item, that there may be more than one intermediate step. And if any one cause is taken away, the effect will also be absent. Hence, if there were not a first item in the series of efficient causes, there would be no intermediate or final items. But if the series of efficient causes stretches back ad infinitum to eternity, there will be no first efficient cause, which will mean that there will be no final effect, and no intermediate efficient causes, which is patently not the case. Hence it is necessary to posit some first efficient cause, and this everyone calls God. So this is an argument that is similar to the first. But the first argument is talking about the final cause, right, which is actuality, moving from the potential to the actual, which is done through the motivation of the desire for the higher thing, right, and the unmoved mover there. The second argument comes from the notion of efficient cause, which means that we have to go back in history. Everything that's in the world has a history. There's a cause that it is the effect of, right? And this chain of cause and effect cannot go on forever, because that would be absurd. Because what would mean is that nothing was ever the first cause, and if there's not a first cause, there's not an end cause. We don't have a way to have arrived at this moment, and so the thing that started off the first cause, that would be God. So we have 2 arguments. They're kind of similar, right? They're kind of similar. Let's look at the third way. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and goes as follows. We come across some things which are merely possibles. Right? Some things are possible things. This is not a surprise to us. Right? They can both be and not be. For example, some things coming into being and passing away and having the possibility of being and not being. But it is impossible for everything there is to be of this sort, since if something has the possibility of not being, then at some time or other it lacks being. So if all things have the possibility of not being, at some time there was nothing at all. This is an old argument. So it goes like this. For everything that's in the world, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. So we can think of ourselves that way, right? We can think back, well, there was a time that we weren't, 1925. That was a time that there was no me and there was no you, right? So there was a time that we weren't. We didn't have being then. And now, in 2022, there's a time that we are, right? That's the time now. And then later on, there will be a time that we won't be again. But that's not just true of people. That's true of anything. It's true of books. It's true of rocks. It's true of planets. It's true of stars. That for everything that there is, there's a time when it is and a time when it isn't. So, Aristotle says that, and again, infinity is brought into this, right? If we had an infinite amount of time, there would be a time when everything was, and a time that nothing was. A time that everything was, and a time that nothing was. And this is absurd, especially if there's a time that everything, or that nothing was, right? He says, it is impossible for everything there is to be of this sort, since if something has the possibility of not being, then at some point or other, it lacks being. So if all things have the possibility of not being, at some time there was nothing at all. Right? But if this were the case, there would still be nothing now, since what lacks being does not begin except through something which is. Right? So we know that. We know that what lacks being begins with something that is. I mean, that's true of everything, even simple things like this binder clip, right? This binder clip is something that came into being because of something else that had being that made it, right? So it's impossible for if there was truly infinite time and everything could either be or not be, then there would be a time that nothing was, right? And if time went backwards an infinite amount, we would have arrived at that, right? But once there's a time that nothing was, then that state has to be permanent, right? It has to be permanent because nothing can come from nothing, right? And he says that here. If all things have the possibility of not being, at some time there was nothing at all. But if this were the case, then there would still be nothing now, since what lacks being does not begin except through something which is. So if nothing wasn't being, it was impossible for anything to begin to be, and so there would still be nothing, which is patently not the case. Hence, not all beings are possibles. There must be something in the world which is necessary, right? So not all beings in the world are of this category of possible beings. Some of the beings in the world are of the category of necessary beings. They can't not be. What does that sound like? It sounds like our friend Anselm that we talked about the other day. Can't not be, right? Now, everything which is necessary has the cause of its necessity from elsewhere, or it does not. But it is not possible that a sequence of necessary beings having the cause of their necessity elsewhere should continue ad infinitum forever, as was proved in the case of efficient causes, So it is necessary to posit something which is necessary in its own right, and it does not have the cause of its necessity from elsewhere, but is itself the cause of necessity in other things, and this everyone calls God. Right, so this is the next argument. Right, this is the third way, and there's only 5 of these, and they are all sounding pretty similar, and very few of them sound like St. Anselm. Now the fourth way, and the fourth way, I will tell you from the outset, the fourth way is my favorite way, right? The fourth way is taken from the gradations to be found in things, right? The gradations in things, where we have more of or less of. And then this is starting to sound a little bit like Plato, right? Because in Plato, you can have the sensible objects in the world, you can have it be more or less than the form that it is in the invisible world. But we'll take it as given that there are gradations to be found in things. We come across the same things which are more or less good or true or noble than others, and so on. But more or less are terms used of different things by reference to how close they are to what is the greatest of its kind, right? What is the greatest of its kind? So you're going to think form when you think the greatest of its kind. For example, something is hotter if it is closer to what is hottest. Hence, there is something which is truest and best and noblest. Right? These are the forms. Truth itself, greatness itself, nobility itself. Right? These are the forms. And consequently, greatest in being. For things which are truest are greatest in being, as Aristotle says in Book 2 of his Metaphysics. You see, Aquinas read his stuff. Now, what we call the greatest in any kind is the cause of everything of that kind, just as fire, which has the greatest heat, is the cause of everything hot, as Aristotle says in the very same book. Hence, there is something which is the cause of being and goodness and every other perfection in things, and this we call God. Right? And we can see how this is a Platonic argument, right? Because what did Plato say? He said, well, there are these things, right? We have the sensible objects in the world, and what is it that accounts for, two different beautiful things both being beautiful? And we could even say, well, this thing on the left is more beautiful than that thing on the right, but there has to be a beauty itself. There has to be a beauty itself that gives beauty to all the instances of beauty, right? And Plato agreed. And Aquinas agrees, right? Because that's how gradations themselves are possible, right? That's how that works. And just like Plato, remember we talked about the divided line, just that Plato has on the very top the good, right? So too does Aristotle, or so too does Aquinas. That good has to be there to account for the variability of the world. It has to be the standard by which other things compare. Things. So you have you have the beautiful things in the world, right? And then you have the form of beauty that makes them all beauty. But then you have the collection of the forms, right? You have all these forms, and what the question that we didn't ask in Plato, but it's like staring us in the face is, well, what is it that makes them all forms? And the answer to that question is the form of being itself, or the good. And that's what Aquinas is talking about here, and that's the fourth way. All right, now we have the fifth way. It says the fifth way is taken from the manner in which things are directed or guided. We see some things that lack knowledge, namely natural bodies, working for the sake of a goal or end. It is clear from the fact that they are always or often act in the same way to pursue what is best, and this shows that they reach their goal not by chance, but from directedness. But things which do not have knowledge do not tend towards a goal unless they are guided by something with knowledge and intelligence, as an arrow is by the archer. Hence, there is some intelligent being by whom all natural things are directed toward their goal or end, and this we call God. I think we could say that even if we're not talking about a natural thing, we could talk about that as like a human being. So there's something guiding human beings toward their natural goal or end. There's something guiding flowers toward their natural goal and end. And this has to be directed by an intelligence, and that intelligence we call God. So these are the 5 ways of Aquinas. They are brief, they are short, they are from the Summa Theologiae, and they're very different. They're very different from the argument that Anselm made for the existence of God. These arguments might feel better, except for maybe the 4th way. The 4th way is the one that people struggle with. But there's a certain kind of more intuitive sense about them. A lot of these are connected to what is called the genetic argument, the whole idea that there has to be a first cause, this idea that an infinite universe somehow is absurd and we can't grasp it, right? That there has to be a beginning to things. And so arguments for the existence of God that talk about the necessity of there being a beginning for things, these are the ones that are most similar to St. Thomas. Next time, we're going to continue with St. Thomas, but we're going to talk about a different question. So the past couple of lectures have been about the existence of God because this is a medieval philosophy unit, and that was a big question for medieval philosophy. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is going to be ethics. We're going to talk about virtue ethics again. So we talked a little bit about virtue ethics when we talked about when we talked about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. The medieval people were big into virtue ethics, but they had some particular questions. And so we're going to be taking a look at those in the next video. I know this one is a little bit shorter than the last one, but I think we've covered the 5 ways.